So generally, the outside world, they're obsessed with what can't be done rather than what could be done. I mean, this passport scheme was one opportunity where they could have got behind it, pushed it, and actually, honestly, I think saved thousands of people in the process. But they didn't for bureaucratic reasons. I think to some extent, you have to say probably at one level, anti-Semitic reasons as well.
Hello and welcome to this week's pod. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and today's guest is Roger Moorhouse, the author of a new book, The Forgers, and he's joined me to talk about the Holocaust and the efforts of a few Polish diplomats to get victims out. They set up a passport scheme in Switzerland and sent passports to Jews in camps to get them out, all the while battling with the bureaucracies of the West, as you heard from Roger at the top there. Do get in touch with me if you have any comments or suggestions. Coming up, I've got plenty more great history, including a bonus with a former cabinet minister discussing the coalition government, Elizabeth I, the Dark Ages, and Tom Holland joins to talk Roman history and other history-related questions. Please do share the pod with your friends. It really helps to grow. Thanks very much for listening, but that's enough from me. I'll hand you over to me, talking to Roger Moorhouse on the Holocaust. Roger Moorhouse, welcome back to the podcast. Last time we had you on, you gave us a little bit of a trailer to what we're going to be talking about today, which is your new book, your latest book, The Forgers, the forgotten story of the Holocaust's most audacious rescue operation, which is now out. And so thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure, Ollie.
And yeah, as I say, when we did our Books of the Year chat, you were just explaining a little bit more about your book. Mm-hmm. But I think if we're all honest, we had a few that day, so I've completely forgotten what you were talking about.
Yeah.
But luckily, I've been reading the book, so
excellent.
Which we were just
you probably know more about it than I do at the moment.
Well, listeners, just before we started recording, I was just saying how much I was enjoying this book, very readable. And it's also, I mean, there's so much in it, particularly around the Holocaust. So it's obviously a very dark subject. And I wanted to start off by asking you, Roger, because your book opens with a conference, a global conference in, I think, the summer of 1938 in Evian on Lake Geneva in France. And there seems to be, and I wanted really to ask you about the kind of the attitude or the global environment there was about Jews, particularly Jews in Nazi Germany, who are obviously looking for, we're post-Kristallnacht, and so they're looking for a way out. And what was the...
Well, we're not, in the summer of 38, we're not yet post-Kristallnacht, because Kristallnacht is coming up in late 38.
Oh, right.
But yeah, the attitude doesn't really change. What prompted that conference, and it was specifically to talk about, as they termed it, the refugee crisis. It was called by Roosevelt himself, and was supposedly to solve this or to address this refugee crisis. And they were very wary of even using the word Jew or Jewish in discussing this refugee crisis, as if it was some sort of general, refugee crisis affecting the whole world. The spark for it, of course, was the Anschluss, the German annexation of Austria, which had happened in March, and large numbers of Jews, particularly in Vienna, but elsewhere in Austria as well, and some Jews who had escaped from Germany into Austria in the previous sort of few years, and had now been faced with the prospect of being annexed by that same anti-Semitic racist regime. So there is this crisis of Jewish emigration out of Austria. And the outside world, and this is kind of typified by the conference, the outside world is kind of wringing its hands and making all the right noises and saying, well, isn't it dreadful? And yet doing precisely bugger all to alleviate the problem. So much so, as I said before, that they even don't want to acknowledge it as a Jewish problem, first and foremost. And they don't want to acknowledge that Nazi Germany is the cause of this problem. So they're sort of very wary of, using any sort of critical language, towards Berlin or anything like that. And I don't, it's quite remarkable. The whole intention of Evian seems to be to kind of kick the can down the road in the hope that it will eventually go away. It was a big conference with lots of representatives of all, a lot of states around the world. And they all lined up essentially to say, well, we can't take any more Jews or any Jews because of X, Y, and Z reasons, but we think that you other countries should. Right, because this is a real problem and we think you should take. And then the other countries stand up and say, well, we can't take Jews because ABC problems, so we think someone else should. Right, so it's just lining up representative after representative, basically explaining why they can't do anything about the problem and kicking the can down the road. So nothing is done in the end. And it's quite, we've got to recognize that the Holocaust itself has, of course, not started yet. Right, and to be fair to those representatives at Evian, they can't really foresee it. We know 2020 hindsight, we know what happened, barely 2.5 years later. We know the Holocaust is then underway, 1941 and so on. You've got the sort of the beginnings of systematic industrialized killing, but they couldn't have foreseen that, to be fair to them. But it is still symptomatic of this sort of general outside world, but particularly Western attitude, which is that, well, the Jews are, it's kind of someone else's problem. Let's just kick the can down the road and hope that it will go away. And that was typified at Evian, and it's typified later on as well at a second conference in 1942, believe it or not, at Bermuda, where essentially the same outcome is arrived at. So what I wanted to do by using that as my opening chapter was to kind of demonstrate that the outside world, and particularly the Western outside world, was not sympathetic to the Jewish problem. And I think this is important because with the benefit of hindsight, and we tend to have, everyone has a sort of slightly rosy view of their own role in history, I think, to some extent, maybe with the exception of the Germans, but everybody else, right? So I think we kind of assume that, well, the Western world would have done something to save the Jews in the Holocaust if only they'd known what was going on, right? So then it becomes a question of when did they know, which is something else that I address in the book. But I wanted to make the point that actually the outside world, maybe it wasn't actively hostile, but it was certainly pretty indifferent to Jewish suffering. And even once the war's underway, you still have lots of bureaucratic obstacles put up from various organizations that you'd think were, higher minded than that, like the US State Department, for example. That are putting obstacles up to any sort of measures that would help Europe's Jews. So I really wanted to use that to illustrate that the outside world is not kind of waiting in the wings, desperate to help. It's more or less actively indifferent to the Jewish plight. So I think that throws up into sharp relief those that actually do try and do something concrete and real to assist the Jews once the Holocaust is underway.
But tragically, it's such a small number of people who do help. But do you think it's the 1930s? It really does show, if you add in appeasement of Nazi Germany, it was a real breakdown of moral leadership in the mid to late 1930s.
Yes, I think, yeah. I mean, if you describe it like that, if you rope it in with appeasement, I'm always a little bit wary of throwing appeasement and with it Chamberlain under the bus, because I think in political and strategic terms, he was a man of his time, and I think it was a policy of its time, and it was fundamentally rational. The problem was it was assuming that Hitler was a rational actor as well, but Hitler wasn't a rational actor. That was the problem. So the best thing you can say about appeasement is that they ended it, and they ended it fairly swiftly once they realized that this was not a rational actor that they were dealing with after Munich. So maybe that could have come earlier, but appeasement itself was not fundamentally an irrational or I would argue even a wrong policy. It's just that it was being directed at the wrong subject. Nazi Germany would not be appeased, did not want to be appeased, did not want to be satisfied. So I'm always a little bit wary with that, but I kind of agree with the drift of your question that there is a failing of moral leadership here, and you see that. I mean, I was surprised. I've been asked before. I did some press with this. I had interviewed by a Polish press outlet, and they said, what surprised you when you wrote this book? And you learn when you put these books out that after a couple of months you've been asked every question under the sun and the answer is already there. But that one, because it was an early interview, I actually hadn't thought, and I sort of thought for a minute. And it was that the West, the outside world, the West in shorthand, was actively indifferent to this, even up until 43, 44. There are State Department memos going around, which I cite in the book, who are actively talking about this passport scheme, which we're going to come on to, and saying, oh, we don't like that at all. That's not, we shouldn't allow people to benefit from illegal activity. They're trying to save lives, for God's sake. How kind of bureaucratically small-minded you have to be in 1944 to be saying things like that in the State Department in Washington. I found that quite astonishing, and I still do. So again, it sort of flags up this idea that the outside world really, if it wasn't indifferent, it was actively hostile. It was kind of really quite a serious problem. And I think we misunderstand that aspect of it when we look back and we think of the Holocaust. We think of ourselves nobly trying to, wanting to help but not being able to for different reasons. But that really isn't the case.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the detail around Western governments during the war when they do know a little bit more. But it's really the invasion of Poland that, and you've written obviously in great detail about the invasion of Poland in your last book, First to Fight, but really it's the experience of Poland which is almost unique amongst occupied. Well, actually, I'm sort of hesitant to use such strong language because I obviously Russia experiences terrible treatment from Nazi Germany when they're during invasion, but Poland sort of carved into this sort of two sections, North and Western Poland, and then the central government, which is the
general government.
The general government. Sorry, the general government. Yeah.
So Poland is partitioned. I mean, as listeners will know from First to Fight, Poland is partitioned by the Germans and the Soviets in 1939. It's been called the Fourth Partition because Moscow, Berlin, and Vienna had previously carried out three partitions of Poland in the 18th century. So it's often described as the Fourth Partition. So Poland basically is wiped off the map in 1939 again. As you said, the North and the West is sort of hived off and annexed direct to the Reich. That becomes German territory, and they ship out anyone essentially who isn't German. And the eastern half is taken directly by the Soviets and is annexed to the Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet republics. And essentially that border was restored in 1944. So that's still the same border now. That's the western border of Ukraine and Belarus. And the middle bit, which is sort of ironically or appropriately, a sort of teardrop-shaped bit in the middle. It was called the General Government, which has Warsaw at the top and then Krakow at the bottom as part of that teardrop. And that was wholly under German control. It wasn't independently run by the Poles. It became a racial dumping ground. So that's where ultimately they wanted to, deport all of the Jews into in the short term prior to their extermination. And they deported a lot of Poles into that territory as well. So that, as I said, became a sort of German-controlled racial dumping ground. And that's where a lot of those sort of worst atrocities of the Holocaust and of the German occupation of Poland, which are two separate but related things, take place. I mean, the German occupation of Poland was one of the cruelest in occupied Europe. I think it's one of these misconceptions is that German occupation regimes were sort of similar across the board. They weren't. If you were in France or if you were in somewhere like Denmark, it was a very light touch because the Germans actually kind of respected the French and the Dutch or the Danes as being sort of fellow civilized Germanics or adjacent to being Germanics. The Poles were seen as one up the racial hierarchy from the Jews. They were completely expendable. And worse than that, the Poles had also opted to resist in 1939, which to the Nazi mind was adding insult to injury. So the occupation regime against the Poles is extremely harsh and extremely cruel. I use an example of the book of the massacre at Wawa in 1939, Christmas 39, where two German gendarmes are shot by Polish criminals in a bar, and in response, 115 Poles, Polish men are simply rounded up on the street and taken out and shot. And that was considered at the time as the humane option, because I think every other prisoner that they rounded up was let go. I mean, it's the brutality of the German occupation of Poland itself is almost indescribable. It's no quarter given, no quarter expected. It's absolutely brutal. So you've got to understand, again, Polish responses to the Holocaust, which sort of happens within that same within that same space and within that same milieu, because half of the Holocaust dead are Polish Jews, of course, right? That's another thing we tend to forget. So the Holocaust, to a large extent, is happening in and around that sort of brutal atmosphere for ordinary Poles. So that has to be understood in terms of gauging the Polish response to the Holocaust as well. So there's a lot in the book that I try and give context to all of this, to explain this sort of background, not only in terms of what the outside world knows and when and how that information comes out, which is very, very interesting, but how Polish responses to the Holocaust are kind of forming at the time as well, because they're also in a very, very difficult situation.
Exactly. That's exactly the kind of context that's where we get our forgers and Alexander Loro. Yeah, I was hoping you'd help me out with the pronunciation there. The ambassador in Switzerland. Yeah. It's in that context that he begins in quite small numbers to start with, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting because it does it very much evolves. It's not, I think we often think, when you see an event like this, you imagine that, this was a group of 6 plotters, if you like, or conspirators, and 3 of them are career diplomats. They're Polish diplomats in Switzerland. 3 are career diplomats. 1 is Polish local staff, and then 2 are Jewish activists. Both of Polish extraction, but one of whom was, technically Polish. So there's a very, very strong Polish element to this. But they're working in Switzerland. And I think we often imagine with things like this that they sort of got together in a smoky room and they said, right, chaps, the Holocaust is happening. What are we going to do about it? We've got to do something to help. And then sort of thrash out a plan over sort of, a bottle of port and some cigars. That really isn't how this works. It's very, very organic. Hopefully it comes across in that way, that it was completely organic, that there are other rescue operations that were kind of going on at the same time or previous to it. There's particularly one by a chap called Sugihara, who was the Japanese consul in Kaunas in Lithuania in 1940. And Lithuania became one of those places that Polish Jews escaped to after that, as I said, partition of Poland, because they didn't want to live necessarily in the Soviet zone. So they tended to go north into Lithuania, which was then still nominally independent, and as a way of trying to escape Soviet rule, to try and wait out the war if they could. And then when the Soviets then decide to annex Lithuania, which they do in the summer of 1940, then all of those Polish Jews, and as well as Lithuanian Jews, kind of go, oh shit, right, okay, we have to get out of here, right? So there's this plan is hatched that Sugihara will give them Japanese visas so that they can go across the Soviet Union eastward, entry into Japan. There's a transit visa to Japan is what he's giving out. And then they can get on somewhere else out of there. Usually, what was usually given was Curacao, of all places. Curacao was given as the end destination. But because that was how the bureaucracy worked, you had to have an end destination, you had to have transit visas to cross Japan and so on. Nowadays, with the free travel that we tend to enjoy, we almost forget that this was the nature of the beast. 80 years ago, you had to have the right paperwork to get into a country, never mind get across it and get out of it at the other side. So all of that stuff, not only just passports, but everything else as well. So they were doing that, again, assisting Polish Jews. There's a strong sort of Polish element to that story as well. So the people in Bern, my Ładoś group in Bern, would have known about this, and there's proof that they knew about it. So in the spring of 41, they've got Jews then coming to them and saying, well, we've heard about this, this now closed exit route. How about you do something like that? So there's these sort of rumors. And then there's another, the honorary consul that they're using, who was a Swiss solicitor, local solicitor, who's honorary consul of Paraguay. He'd been distributing visas in 1938 around the Anschluss crisis. So it's very organic how this all comes together and the idea begins to form. It's initially very, very piecemeal. And then as the outside world, particularly as the Holocaust gets going, and this is why the wider context of how the Holocaust develops was so important to the narrative. The more, Jews in the ghettos of occupied Poland and elsewhere begin to get an inkling of what their fate might be, that this is, they're not going to be able to sit this one out. This is existential. Then they write letters to any contacts they have, get us passports, get us out of here, whatever it is. And it sort of begins, this drip turns into something like a tsunami. And at some point, and I describe it in the book, they sort of get together, my conspirators, as it were. They get together and say, well, what are we going to do, right? Because this is getting serious and we're getting so many requests. So how are we going to manage this? And with that, effectively, this operation is born. And they begin really a quite systematic kind of cottage industry of forging Latin American passports, mainly Paraguayan, using this tame honorary consul. He's the one that is paid, actually. He's the only one that makes any money out of it. He's paid quite a handsome amount of money per passport.
And he's Swiss, isn't he? Working for
Swiss,
as sort of nominated by the Paraguayan government to assist in these.
So he's a Swiss local, actually a former diplomat. He's quite a shadowy figure. I was desperate to try and find a picture of him for the authorities that couldn't do so, which was really annoying. His name was Rudolf Hügli. So he was a local Swiss barrister, former diplomat, or lawyer rather than barrister. And it was just, the normal sort of person that they tend to use as honorary consuls, where they don't have necessarily diplomatic staff. They use local, trustworthy, in inverted commas, trustworthy individuals to act in their stead. So he was doing that, and he had done it for many years. And he was just producing, Paraguayan documents, passports, and these other things called promesas, which is a sort of a lesser thing, which basically is a letter, an official letter that says, Bill Smith is recognized as a citizen of Paraguay, right? And it was much cheaper, and it didn't require photographs, and it didn't require all of the sort of the stamps and all the rest of it. But it was considered to be a much less impressive document than having an actual passport. But, in many cases needs must. So they used him, and it's reckoned, it was estimated in early 44 by one of the group. They reckoned that they had produced identity documents for 10,000 people. And how
did they get them? Sorry to interrupt you there, Roger, but they sort of posted them to people.
Yeah, in many instances, it was still possible to some extent to post stuff. Otherwise, it went by courier or through the sort of the underground network. I mean, the postal system kind of still worked. It's quite bizarre.
Even into the ghettos?
To some extent. I mean, there's a difference between those areas that were annexed direct to the Reich. So somewhere like Łódź, what the Germans called Litzmannstadt, was annexed direct to the Reich. So there, the postal service kind of worked more or less unhindered, right? So you could post something to Łódź and in expectation it would actually get there. And the same thing with Benjin. There's a place called Benjin, which is down in Upper Silesia now, not far from Auschwitz, actually. And that was a big Jewish center, which was also annexed direct to the Reich. So you could send normal mail into somewhere like Benjin, and there was a ghetto in Benjin. You could send normal mail there within reasonable expectation it would arrive. Much sketchier trying to get things into somewhere like the Warsaw Ghetto because of interception by the Gestapo, just things getting robbed, whatever it was. So that's much more difficult. But they did try, or you could use couriers, or you could use the sort of networks through the Polish underground as well. So there are ways and means depending on where you want to get this stuff to. So yeah, that side of it was not generally too much of a problem. It sounds counterintuitive, but postal systems to some extent still kind of work.
And so I just wanted to drill into the knowledge side of things, because the group in Switzerland sort of gets inklings and gets news coming through of the Holocaust in sort of towards late 41, really, don't they? Maybe not.
Yes.
That's when
the Holocaust proper is only really going in the autumn of 41. To be fair, I mean, there is sort of piecemeal persecution and executions of Jews and massacres and so on, even in September 39, as I've written about before. But the real, if you're going to define the Holocaust as the kind of systematic, even industrialized slaughter almost of the Jews, but certainly that word systematic is important. Then really it's the autumn of 41. It coincides to a large extent with Operation Barbarossa. So that's when they start this sort of, the systematic rounding up and execution of Jews on the Eastern Front and beyond, and in that area of Eastern Poland, which has been occupied by the Soviets for 2 years. So as the Germans move through that, you've got the Einsatzgruppen behind them, basically rounding up anyone that looks at them askance, but especially Jews. Taking them out, outside of town, digging pits and shooting them. This is the systematic, execution of Jews, and that's really the beginning of the Holocaust proper. So already that autumn, piecemeal reports of this are sort of dribbling out, to the Western world and being talked about in Polish underground circles as well. So there was one of the great sort of intelligence sources on this was the intelligence reports to the Polish underground. Polish, and again, this was an important strand of the story I needed to explain how the Polish underground formed, what its purpose was, what its relationship to the Polish government in exile in London was, and so on. So they were one of the main sources of this intelligence, but it is necessarily piecemeal. So they will hear, for example, through the grapevine, there was a massacre up at such and such, 400 people killed, another 500 people killed at such and such a place, and they would feed this out. But they're not yet in a position where they can see the bigger picture. So that takes more time. That takes into 1942, for example, before people are beginning to put two and two together and get four.
Well, quite a significant date in 42 is early on on the 20th of January. You get the Wannsee conference, chaired by Reinhard Heydrich.
Yeah.
And this is, I guess, this sort of bureaucratic machinery being sort of agreed and cleared by the German state, effectively, isn't it?
Yeah, it's often described as sort of the smoking gun in a way, which is not entirely correct, because the Holocaust is already happening on the ground. So those orders have already gone out to some extent. Whether there is a smoking gun of a Hitler document that's signed with it, with his signature saying, this is what we're going to do. I don't think there is. I think
the camps are a smoking gun, really, aren't they?
Yeah, but it's much more organic than that. Most of the camps actually, the first one into operation actually doing systematic killing of Jews is Chełmno, out to the west of Warsaw, where they use gas fans, particularly, again, which I describe, which is it's a horrible passage. That's one that sort of stays with me, that description of how the gas fans operated and how they were cleaned out and so on, which I found that eyewitness account, which is really quite harrowing.
Yeah, I've just been reading that section.
Actually. Yeah, it is. Is quite gruesome. So that's already in operation late 41. The main push really it coincides with Heydrich's death, actually, in the summer of 42, which again I described that link, because the Nazis, in their sort of twisted logic, they see that as Heydrich's death is a blow struck against Nazism. So to
a particularly painful death, we should mention.
Yes, joyously, absolutely painful death. But they interpret that as a sort of a blow struck against Nazism, and the only people that could possibly be striking that blow would be the World Jewish Conspiracy, right? So the Jews have to pay. That's the logic. So they do step up. All of those, when they set up the extermination camps to exterminate Polish Jews in later 42 and 43, the operation is called Operation Reinhard. The link is as explicit as that. This is revenge for what you people did. It wasn't Jews who killed him. They see it in terms of this grand conspiracy. So this is revenge for killing Heydrich. Right? So between late 42 and early 43, that's where it really kicks into gear. But as I said, the outside world is piecing this together, using a lot of that Polish underground intelligence that's been gathered, and people like Jan Karski, the great Jan Karski, acting as a courier, bringing this stuff out to the West and telling the world, which he did, enormous personal cost, enormous bravery. And the West really knows by the end of 42, we have enough information and enough context that we can put this together, and they do. And again, this is an important part of the book, was to trace that development of knowledge getting out, because it informs everything that follows.
Yes,
diplomatic wrestles around recognition of these passports, for example.
Yeah, which is painful.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're producing passports between 41 and the end of 43, effectively. At which point they're really being shut down. I mean, they kind of shut it down the end of 42, effectively, but then they do continue. But they're being shut down. They're being investigated by the Gestapo. The Swiss police are clamping down on them at the behest of the Gestapo, and they're being, the Germans are trying to infiltrate them and all of this sort of thing. They actually arrest the members of the Ładoś group to try and pressure them into stopping. That doesn't work, so they go after the honorary consuls, and the honorary consuls are then removed from the scene. So that means that the operation effectively breaks down in 43. And then from then on, for the last 2 years of the war, effectively, what you have is a sort of extended diplomatic wrestle with the outside world, kind of, I say divided, but the Poles, the Polish diplomatic circles, and people like Ładoś in Switzerland, and the Jewish aid agencies, kind of contacting anyone that will listen and saying, look, we've produced all of these passports. As I said, 10,000 individuals. They are currently being held in German camps, right? So the gist was that it kind of, it poked, having one of these passports sort of poked a stick in or a spanner in the works of the Holocaust mechanism. An important part of the mechanism of the Holocaust was to de-legalize the individual, right? So that you had no citizenship, you had no, there was no one that would speak for you. You basically in a position where you and they could do whatever they wanted with you, right? Which doesn't sound that significant to the modern mind, but it was. It's an important part of the process from the German perspective. And if one of these individuals who's about to be deported to Auschwitz, for example, waves a Paraguayan passport and says, well, hang on, I'm a Paraguayan, right? Then they go, oh God, another one. But they pull you out of the line and they send you to, of all places, Belsen, particularly bad reputation amongst British readers because it was one of the main or one of the first camps that the British troops actually liberated. And it was horrific at the end of the war. But earlier on in the war, it was used as sort of a hybrid. It had various subcamps within it, and it had, various regimes within those subcamps. And one of those regimes was to house what they called exchange Jews, which was foreign Jews who were being kept for a possible exchange with Germans held abroad. Okay, so your man who is in the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, holds up his spurious Paraguayan passport and says, "No, hey, you can't do this to me. I'm a Paraguayan." He gets pulled out of the line. He gets sent to Belsen and kept there, actually in reasonable conditions at the beginning. In any case, kept in reasonable conditions, not forced to work, for example. The food was relatively okay at the beginning, and he's basically surviving there, expecting at some point some exchange for Germans abroad. That was the logic from a German perspective. So that sort of 2-year wrestle with the Poles saying, you have to do anything possible to persuade the Latin American governments to publicly recognize these documents. Otherwise, these people are going to be killed. Logical answer, right? They saw it as a humanitarian operation. Ładoś himself, in arguing for this, said, this is a humanitarian operation. We're trying to save as many people as possible, I quote, right? The outside world, particularly the Americans, not so much. They're not really on side. They're saying, well, we're not sure that we should allow this to happen. This is fraudulent activity. They're worried about espionage, that anyone that might get exchanged out to the outside world is actually a German spy, all this sort of thing. So they're actually pushing the Latin American governments not to recognize them. So this one strand of the second half of the book is that wrestle, which I think is heartrending, because the Poles are trying to explain the situation, what they've done, and saying, just publicly say you will recognize these passports. And the Latin Americans, egged on by the Americans, are basically saying, no, we're not going to. And then in the process of that wrestle, the Germans kind of get wind of what's going on. They hear that the recognition is not going to be forthcoming. And in batches of 2,000, they send them all to Auschwitz and they're slaughtered. I mean, it's heartrending. It's absolutely heartrending.
It really is devastating reading. And I wanted to ask you, because as you've pointed out, the Western governments are aware of the Holocaust by late 1942. What do you think the response between that and the end of the war? How do you think, I guess overall, how do you think Western governments responded? I mean, obviously in the case of these passports being issued out of Switzerland, they were obviously fell short on that side of things. But overall,
Yeah.
How do you think Western governments behave?
I would, in general, badly. I think the only word for it is badly. They were mouthing platitudes. There's very little thought given to what was possible. There was lots of thought given to what wasn't possible. The general attitude was one of, again, it's kicking the can down the road, but the intention is a seemingly plausible one, which is that, well, our priority has to be to win the war. We save the Jews by winning the war quicker. And anything that stops that happening or gets in the way of that victory delays that victory. So that's a bad thing, right? So there's even discussion of sort of, dropping food supplies into the camps, for example, which is dismissed because, well, why should we feed the Nazis prisoners for them? I mean, again, it's quite logical, but there was perhaps a possibility there of something that could have been done. So generally, they're obsessed with what can't be done rather than what could be done. I mean, this passport scheme was one opportunity where they could have got behind it, pushed it, and actually, I think saved thousands of people in the process. But they didn't, for bureaucratic reasons. I think to some extent, you have to say probably at one level, anti-Semitic reasons as well. It's the Jews again. It's they're a pain in the arse. They're permanently complaining about everything. That's the kind of attitude. A lot of the early accounts of the Holocaust were dismissed in Western capitals as being Jewish hysteria. So there is this sort of latent. I mean, it's not the same anti-Semitism as the Nazis are expressing, but it's still there, and it's still it's a roll of the eyes, and it's it's the Jews again. So there's a degree of anti-Semitism in there, without question. But I don't think the Western governments, acquitted themselves very well at all. A lot of it is platitudinous, obsessed with what can't be done. There's a couple of exceptions. The War Refugee Board set up by Roosevelt in 1944 actually tried to cut through a lot of this sort of bureaucratic sclerosis in the US, and actually did try and look at what was possible. So there are some exceptions. But generally, and this is what the Wadosh group were up against as well, was this kind of, it's almost like the old Soviet "niet" culture. You just say no. And if you say no enough times, then people go away, stop asking. And it was the same sort of attitude to a large degree. So yeah, I don't think they acquitted themselves very well at all.
And where's the historiography on this, Roger? Obviously, your book is very important on what happened. And, our leaders in the West, we all laud Winston Churchill, of course, but this is a bit of a weak spot.
Yeah, I mean,
do we read
Churchill,
is there a lot of books that are out there about this kind of thing? I mean, we're seeing more and more now, I think, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, Churchill, must be said, was a great sort of philo-Semite, which is an unusual thing in this time. So he's one that deserves honourable mention. But that didn't really change much. It didn't move much. I mean, again, the British response is largely platitudinous, unfortunately. Where the historiography is, there's a bit on this. I mean, this is talked about. There's a great book by Richard Brightman, which came out probably 20 years ago, on the Western knowledge and Western responses to the Holocaust. So that, in that sense, there's nothing particularly new about that. But I think there's a couple of points that are quite new that my book goes into, which is I suppose looking at the Polish side of this, because Poland is not generally acknowledged in sort of Holocaust studies circles. Poland is seen generally as part of the problem rather than part of the solution, and there's various reasons for that. I mean, it had the interwar relations between the Polish state and its large Jewish minority were not good. There was a lot of popular anti-Semitism in Poland. I mean, anti-Semitism is a pretty much universal disease, arguably still is to some extent, but certainly was back in the first half of last century. Popular anti-Semitism in Poland as bad, if not worse than elsewhere. So it did have a very checkered record in that respect. Once you've got the German occupation regime, and as I said before, the hardship that it imposed on Poles and Jews alike, that sort of metastasizes a lot of those sentiments. So you do have instances of ordinary Poles, dobbing in local Jews who are in hiding, for example, to the Germans, whether it's out of personal gain, venal motives, or for anti-Semitic reasons. But you also get huge numbers of Poles who save Jews at enormous personal risk as well. Occupied Poland was the only country where you had the death penalty for assisting Jews. That doesn't happen anywhere else in occupied Europe. So it is a very mixed record that Poland has. And for the record, again, we should say that Poland has the largest number of righteous, the righteous among the nations, of any other country. So there's points of light in this dark story as well. And my story is one, you can't use that to gainsay everything else and say, well, the Poles were on the side of the angels, because some of them weren't. But it's part of that very complex narrative and that very complex tapestry of that history. These diplomats that I write about, they were on the side of the angels. They were doing this because it was the right thing to do. It was a humanitarian operation. They want, as Wadosh said, we want to save as many people as possible. that needs to be part of the narrative, just as we condemn those that were on the other side of history and condemn and betrayed Jews to the Nazis for whatever reason. It's only by understanding the two sides that we get a full picture of the history. So it shouldn't be used to sort of gainsay the other side, but it's a very important part of a wider and much more complex narrative. And I think a lot of Holocaust study has traditionally been sort of, to coin a phrase, rather apt and rather clumsy phrase, but sort of been ghettoized. It's unwilling to look at what the German occupation regime was like for ordinary Poles, for example. So it will talk about what it was like for Jews, and it won't look at why didn't more Jews help them, more Poles help them, for example, because it doesn't necessarily want to look at the difficulties suffered by ordinary Poles. So to look at this in the round, actually, I think helps us understand the mechanics of the Holocaust a bit better. If we understand the difficulties of life in occupied Poland for ordinary Poles, then it sheds a light on perhaps why some of them were unwilling to help Jews. Having said that, as I said, I mean, an awful lot of them did, but still, that it's an important part of that wider context. And that's something I think the historiography has traditionally missed.
Well, it's now got your book, which is a really, really fantastic read, Roger.
Thank you.
And then the numbers in the epilogue, it's really interesting, you going through the numbers of passports issued as compared with how effective it was after we've got rid of all that diplomatic wrangling you've been talking about. But still, it's an extraordinary achievement that the Ładoś group managed to.
I think so. I mean, the estimate at the moment is 800 plus survivors with Ładoś passports. And I think, this was sort of hidden in the archives. It was more or less forgotten for most of the intervening sort of 80 years. And I hope that this book coming out, which is the first book on it, really, certainly out in English, in the English language, I really hope that this will bring more to light. If there are other families out there of Jewish extraction who have somewhere, a Jewish ancestor who survived the Holocaust, there might be within their sort of narrative this mystical Paraguayan passport, and nobody knew where it came from or who asked for it, but that was the thing that saved their life. And that's not being dramatic. That is how it was for many people. But they never questioned it. They never knew where it came from. They never knew that, if that's part of anybody's story, the overwhelming chances are that that passport came from the Ładoś group in Switzerland. And of course, operational security at the time meant that Ładoś and his team, they didn't publicize what they were doing. So if you were the recipient of one of those passports, you didn't necessarily know where it come from. It just became, it came from so-and-so, whoever it was, whoever your contact was. You didn't know who the other links in the chain were. So it's quite possible that there are many thousands of people out there who have one of these passports in their family history, and they don't even think about it. They don't have a clue about it, and they don't know that that's the reason that they survived. So I'm really hopeful that as a result of this book, we'll get some more to come forward, and if we can add more names to the list of survivors.
I hope so, Roger. Fantastic. Thanks so much for this. It's been absolutely fascinating. The book is The Forgers, and the publication date, I think, is it
10th of August.
10th of August. So when this is out, listeners, it's already been published. So head on down to your local bookshop.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ollie.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you for listening. If there are any listeners wondering how that Paraguayan passport found its way into your family, please do get in touch and I can put you on to Roger. As I said at the start, plenty more episodes to come on fantastic history, so please do share with friends. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.